Welcome to the series of Azure ML Toolbox video tutorials. Today I am going to talk about export data control in Azure ML. This control is used to export the data from Azure ML in various forms. Basically, it writes the dataset to various forms of cloud-based storage in Azure, such as tables, blobs, Hive query, and Azure SQL databases. So let's get started. I have this blood donation data on the canvas. You can also directly download or export this dataset on your local machine. For that, you have to right-click on the output port of this dataset and then select Download. The dataset will be downloaded in its original form. It might be CSV, text file, ARFF, or SVM light file. The other way to get dataset from Azure ML is by using export data control. As mentioned earlier, it writes dataset to cloud-based storage in Azure, such as tables, blobs, Hive query, and Azure SQL databases. So let's get export data control on the canvas. I will search export data in this search box and drag this export data on the canvas. I will connect this dataset to the export data control. So the dataset is now connected and we can export blood donation data into various formats provided by export data control. Let's see different properties of the export data control. The first parameter is please specify data destination. There are 4 different types mentioned under this parameter. Using these types, we can export the data in respective format. So let's see the first type, which is Hive query. Hive query writes the data to a Hive table in an HD inside Hadoop clusters. Hive query is particularly useful for very large datasets, or when you want to pre-process the data using a map-reduce job before loading into a machine learning experiment. Below that, we have Hive table name. In this field, write the name of the Hive table that will store the dataset. After that, we have hcatalog server URI. In this field, type the fully qualified name of the cluster you created. After this, we have to type Hadoop user account name and password. Next field is location of output data. There are 2 options in location of output data. The first field is HDFS and the second is Azure. If you select HDFS, then below that you will have to specify the HDFS server URI. Specify the HD inside cluster name in this field, but without the HTTPS prefix. If you want to store your data in Azure, then choose Azure option in location of output data. If you select this option, a bunch of other options will pop up. In these options, you will have to specify Azure Storage Account Name, Azure Storage Key. In the storage key, paste the key that is provided for accessing the storage account. And in Azure Container Name, you will have to specify the default container for the cluster. Next is Use Cached Results. Select this option if you want to avoid rewriting the Hive table each time you run the experiment. Otherwise, you can select this option. This actually depends on what type of data you have, static or dynamic, so select this option appropriately. Once you are done with setting all the properties, hit Run at the bottom of the page. And after that, you can see your data in the Hive table. Going ahead, let's select second option for data destination, which is Azure SQL Database. We have to set following parameters to use this option. So below that, mention database server name, which is generated by Azure. Then write the database name, which is on the server you specified. Here you cannot create a database. It must already exist on the server. Then type server user account name and password that has access permissions for the database. Next is accept any server certificate. Check this option if you want to skip reviewing the site certificate before you connect it and get the data. But let me warn you, this is an insecure option. Below that, we have comma separated list of columns to be saved option. Type the names of the columns that you want to write to the database. In data table name, type the name of the table where data will be stored. In comma separated list of data table columns, you will have to specify the order in which columns should appear in the destination table. In the next field, we have to indicate how many rows should be returned to the destination table in each batch. By default, the value is set to 50. Increase this value if you have a large number of rows to write. Below that, there is a checkbox which says allow writer success with sporadic failures. If you want to note warnings in log file and you want to keep the logs, then you can check this option. You can also check use cached results based on your dataset. So let's take an example using blood donation data. I will type my database server name, my database name, and account name, password, I won't select this option. Then we have to type the comma separated list of columns to be saved. So let's visualize the dataset. So we have these columns: recency, frequency, monetary, time, and class. So I will paste the list of columns in the original table, which is over here. In data table name, we will type this, and I will copy this in comma separated list of data table columns. This is where we want the columns to appear in the destination table. And then we will type the rows. We will type 100 rows because our data set is quite large. And I will select use cached results, and let's run the experiment. The experiment has finished running and we can see the green tick mark on export data control, which means that the data has been exported to the destination table. You can actually go to the destination server and see the table. So let's see the next option in export data control, which is Azure Table. The Azure Table Service is a data management service in Azure that can store large amounts of structured, non-relational data. This option will export the data to Azure Table Storage. In the next field, specify the authentication type. You can export data to a public shared resource or to a private storage account. Choose SS if you know that the account supports access via public SS URL. This is a time-bound access URL that you can generate by using an Azure Storage utility. Then type or paste the full URI that defines the account and the public blob in the table SS URI field. If your data is in the private account, then choose account option in this field. After that, you must also provide credentials including table account name and the key associated with the storage account, and then type the table name that you want to export. Below that, we have to specify which columns to include in the table schema. For partition key, use the column selector to specify the column that should be used for partitioning the saved dataset for the table in Azure Storage. You might ask, why do we need partition key? Tables in Azure are partitioned to support load balancing across storage nodes. All entities are organized by partition. Therefore, the partition property is required for all the table operations. In Azure Table Row Key, use the column selector to specify the column that should be used for the row key property. The row key property is the system property that is required for every entity in the table. It forms a unique index for every row in the table along with the partition key property which you provided earlier. Make sure the columns you specify in row key property and partition key property should be present in the list of destination columns. Otherwise, you will get an error. For Azure Table Origin columns, use the column selector to specify any additional columns from the dataset that you want to save to the Azure table. Also, include the columns selected as the partition key and row key. The next field is Azure Table Destination Columns. In this, specify the names of the columns to write to the table. For Azure Table Write Mode, indicate how you want the export data to behave when data already exists in the Azure table. So we have multiple options over here. The first option is Insert. This will insert a new entity with a unique primary key. The second option is Merge. It updates an existing entity by updating the entity's properties. It does not replace the existing entity. The third option is Replace. It replaces the contents of given entity in a table. The fourth option is Insert or Replace. This is the most popular option. It inserts the entity if entity does not exist. If the entity exists, it replaces the existing one. The fifth option is Insert or Merge. It inserts the entity if the entity does not exist. If the entity already exists, it merges the provided entity properties with the already existing ones. Indicate whether you want to use cached results or not. And once you are done with setting all the properties, hit the Run button at the bottom of the page. The last option in Export Data module is Azure Blob Storage. By using this option, you will get output in CSV, TSV, or ARFF formats. The Azure Blob service is for storing large amounts of data, including binary data. Azure Blobs can be accessed from anywhere by using either HTTP or HTTPS. There are two types of blob storage: public blobs and blobs that requires login credentials. Below this, we have authentication type. Choose SAS option if you know that the storage supports access via public SAS URL, and type the full URI that defines the account and the public blob over here. Otherwise, select account option. This will save your data to a private account, and then you can provide Azure account name and Azure account key below that. In the text box given below, type the name of the blob where the data will be stored. In Azure Blob Storage Write mode, indicate whether you want any existing blob file to be overwritten. By default, Azure Blob Storage Write mode is set to error, meaning that you will get an error whenever an existing blob file is found. In File Format for blob file, select the format in which data should be stored. As mentioned earlier, it supports CSV, TSV, and ARFF formats. Select the appropriate format. Select Use Cached Results depending on your dataset. Once you are done with setting all the properties, hit Run at the bottom of the page, and your data will be exported to Azure Blob Storage. So this is how export data control works. Thank you.